The cold hit Saralith like a wall when her eyes opened. She gasped and grabbed the sides of the escape pod as the emergency lights flickered above her head. The pod was tiny and dark and smelled like burned metal. She had been in it for 12 days now, maybe more. She had stopped counting after the food ran out. She was Vathari, a tall, silver-skinned being with 4 thin fingers on each hand and eyes the color of deep ocean water. Then her people were ancient and proud and connected to each other through something they called the Weave, a great invisible thread of thought and feeling that ran between every single Vathari alive. When one of them felt joy, the others felt it too. When one of them grieved, the whole collective grieved with them. The Weave was everything to the Vathari. It was home, it was safety, it was identity. But Saralith had never heard it, not once in her entire life. She was born in silence. While every other Vathari child woke to the warm hum of thousands of minds pressing gently against their own, Saralith had woken to nothing. No voices, no feelings, no sense of the great shared world that her people lived inside. The healers had pressed their hands to her temples and closed their eyes and searched for the signal that should have been there. But there was nothing to find. She was empty, a void. They called it unbound, and to the Vathari, and being unbound was the worst thing a person could be. Her mother had cried at the severance ceremony. Saralith had watched the tears run down her mother's silver face and had wanted so badly to reach out and touch her hand. But the elder council stood between them in long white robes, reading from the ancient texts in voices that did not shake, voices that were calm and certain and terrifying. They took her name from the public record. They removed her family bond from the collective registry. And they gave her a new title, Voidborn, and they said it like it was a disease. Then they walked her to a small escape pod at the edge of the colony ship's lower deck. It had a water container enough for 3 weeks, and a food pack meant to last 2. An elder pressed a single button, and the pod was released into space. Her mother did not push through the crowd to stop them. No one did. The pod drifted and drifted and drifted. Saralith spent the first few days crying, ugly. The soundless crying where no one could hear her and no one cared. Then she spent the next few days angry, burning hot anger that had nowhere to go but the cold walls of the pod. Then the food ran out, and the anger turned into something quieter and heavier. She lay on the floor of the pod and looked at the ceiling, and thought about the fact that she was going to die out here, and not a single person in the universe would feel it. That was the worst part. Not the hunger, not the cold, and not even the dying. The worst part was that she had never been felt. She had never been known. She had gone her whole life reaching out into the silence, hoping something would reach back, and nothing ever had. She was 17 years old. On the 14th day, or what she believed was the 14th day, a sound broke through the quiet hum of the pod's failing engine. It was a deep mechanical groan, and then the whole pod shuddered. And Saralith sat up fast and hit her head on the low ceiling and grabbed the wall as the pod swung sideways. Something had caught her. She pressed her face against the small scratched window and looked out into the black. A ship hung in the dark outside, enormous and irregular, covered in panels and welded patches and blinking yellow lights. It was nothing like Vathari design, which was always smooth and white and perfect. That this ship looked like it had been repaired 100 times by 100 different people who all had different ideas about how to do it. Pipes ran along the outside. A large dish antenna sat crooked on the upper hull. Cargo crates were strapped to the side with thick metal chains. Strange symbols covered the side of the ship in large white letters. She did not know what they said. The pod shook again as a tow beam locked around it and pulled it slowly, firmly toward a wide docking bay that was opening up in the belly of the ship. Orange light spilled out from inside. Soralith pressed herself against the back wall of the pod and held her knees to her chest. She had been taught, in the few lessons the collective gave to children before they were woven into the weave, that non-telepathic species were primitive. They were chaotic creatures driven by individual desires and fear and selfish need. They had no shared consciousness, no collective wisdom, no weave to keep them civilized. They were dangerous in the way that animals without a herd are dangerous, unpredictable and wild. She did not know what kind of species flew this strange patched ship. She did not know what they wanted with her. The pod landed with a heavy clang inside the docking bay, and the light outside the window changed from black to orange gold. She heard sounds through the pod wall, footsteps, voices, the clatter of tools being set down. The voices were speaking in a language she had never heard, fast and round and full of rising sounds at the ends of sentences. Then a knock came at the pod door. 3 firm, slow knocks. Not a forced entry, not a command. A knock, like whoever was on the other side was waiting for permission. Soralith stared at the door handle for a long moment. Her hands were shaking. She was starving and terrified and alone, and she had absolutely nothing left to lose. She reached out and pulled the handle. The door swung open, and warm orange light and the smell of something cooking flooded into the cold, dark pod. A woman stood in the doorway, shorter than Soralith, with dark brown skin and silver hair pulled back from her face and eyes the warm amber color of firelight. She looked at Soralith with no fear and no disgust and no pity, just a calm, direct attention, like she was simply seeing her. The woman said something in her fast, round language. Soralith did not understand the words, but somehow she understood the tone. And the tone said, "You are safe now." The woman's name was Dara Vasquez, and she was the captain of the ISV Resolute. She did not flinch when Soralith stepped out of the pod. She did not step back or call for armed crew or point a weapon at the silver-skinned alien standing in her docking bay. She just tilted her head slightly, said something to the 2 crew members behind her, and then pointed down the corridor in a way that clearly meant, "Follow me." Soralith followed, because she had no other option, and because the smell of food was pulling her forward like a hook. The ship was louder on the inside than she had expected. Somewhere deeper in the hull, a machine was clanging in a steady rhythm. 2 people argued at the far end of a corridor in raised voices, and then one of them laughed loudly, and the argument seemed to be over. A small, round robot rolled past her feet without looking up. Everything about the ISV Resolute was busy and warm and slightly chaotic, and nothing at all like the clean, silent order of the Vithari collective. Dara led her to the medical bay, which was a small room with a padded table and shelves full of labeled containers. A young human man with short red hair and freckled hands was already waiting there. He looked at Soralith with wide eyes, not fearful wide eyes, but more like the eyes of someone who had just seen something wonderful and was trying to memorize it. He pressed his hand to his own chest and said a word, probably his name. Then he pointed at Soralith with a questioning look. She understood what he was asking. "Soralith," she said, using the name the collective had erased. He grinned and pointed at himself again. "Finn," he said. Then he got to work, checking her pulse, scanning her with a small handheld device, impressing carefully around the bruise on her temple, where she had hit the ceiling of the pod. He was gentle in a way that felt strange to her. Vithari healers worked efficiently and without much physical contact. The weave told them what a patient was feeling, so they did not need to ask. Finn could not know what she was feeling, and yet he kept pausing and looking at her face as if he was checking, as if her expression mattered to him. And he gave her a nutrient drink that tasted like sweet metal, and she drank all of it in 3 long swallows. Then Dara brought her food, a bowl of something warm and thick with small, soft pieces of orange and green in it. It was nothing like Vithari cuisine, which was always precise and measured and nearly flavorless by design. This food was rich and complicated and slightly too salty and completely extraordinary. Now, Saralith ate the whole bowl without stopping, and then looked up to find Dara watching her with a small smile. Dara said something, and the ship's AI translator, a small speaker clipped to the doorframe, converted it into broken but understandable Vaithari. More? Saralith nodded. Dara brought more. Over the following days, Saralith was given a small cabin of her own, barely larger than her old pod, but infinitely better, with a real mattress and a blanket that was thick and slightly worn from many uses. She was not locked in. No one stood outside the door. She could walk the corridors of the ship freely, though she mostly stayed close to the medical bay and the galley because those were the places where people seemed least startled to see her. The crew of the Resolute was 6 people in total: Dara the captain, Finn the medic, a broad-shouldered woman named Yuki who ran the engine room, as a quiet older man called Bence who navigated, a fast-talking young man named Osei who handled cargo deals, and a cook named Priya who appeared to believe that feeding people was a form of solving every problem. They were all completely different from each other, different sizes and colors and ways of speaking and moving. They disagreed about things openly and noisily. They laughed at things that were not funny to Saralith at all, and they touched each other on the shoulder or the arm without seeming to think about it. None of them were connected by a shared mind. None of them could feel what the others were feeling. And yet somehow they worked together in a way that was smooth and almost beautiful. Saralith watched them the way someone watches a fire, uncertain whether to get close but unable to look away. The translator was getting better as the ship's AI processed more of her speech patterns. She could understand more of what the crew said now. Short sentences, simple words. Dara was patient with the translator's delays and never seemed frustrated when Saralith did not understand something. She would just rephrase it, slower, with her hands moving to help explain. One evening, ship-time evening, when the corridor lights dimmed to a warm yellow, Saralith found Dara sitting alone in the small observation lounge at the front of the ship. The lounge had a wide, curved window that looked out at the stars. Dara had a cup of something steaming in her hands and was just looking at the dark. Saralith stood in the doorway. Dara glanced over and nodded at the seat beside her. An invitation, not a command. Saralith sat. They stayed in silence for a long time, looking at the stars together. Saralith kept waiting for Dara to ask why she had been in that pod. She kept waiting for the questions. Who are you? What did you do? What are you worth? What will you give us in return for all of this? She had been preparing answers in the translator's language, trying to find words that would explain her situation without making herself sound worthless. But Dara did not ask. She just sat there with her warm cup and her calm eyes and let the silence be comfortable. Finally, the translator caught up to something Dara said softly. You can leave when we find somewhere safe for you. And until then, you are crew. Saralith did not know what to do with that. She had been raised in a civilization where every person had a defined function and a defined place, and the weave made sure everyone knew both at all times. She had been cast out for failing to fit the function. And now a stranger, a human with no telepathy and no reason to care, was handing her a place without a price. She sat very still and said nothing because she did not trust herself to speak. But then the ship's scanner gave a short warning sound, and Bence's voice came through the intercom, tense and quick. The translator gave Saralith the key word a second later. Vaithari! She went cold from her feet to the back of her neck. She stood up fast and spun to face Dara with wide eyes, her whole body stiff with a fear she could not hide. Dara looked at her for exactly 2 seconds, reading her face with those steady amber eyes, and then turned to the intercom and gave a single calm order. The ship changed course. No questions, no hesitation, no demand for an explanation. Dara had seen Saralith's face, and that had been enough. Saralith stood at the window and watched the stars shift as the Resolute turned away from the Vaethari patrol signal, and she felt something crack open quietly in the middle of her chest. Something she did not yet have a word for. The neutral trade station called Crosspoint Yova was everything Saralith had never seen and several things she had never imagined. It hung in space like a great spinning wheel, its outer ring lit up with the signs and signals of 100 different species businesses. Ships of every shape and design were docked along its outer arms, sleek Vori couriers next to bulky human freighters next to the strange living ships of the Kaleen, and whose vessels grew like coral and breathed recycled atmosphere through gill slits along their hulls. The ISV Resolute docked at Bay 7 on the human commercial ring, and Dara gave the crew 2 hours of free time while she handled a cargo delivery. Saralith stayed close to Finn as they walked the station's wide inner corridor, a busy, bright, loud place full of beings from across the galaxy, all moving in different directions with different purposes. The smells were overwhelming, and the sounds were overwhelming. After weeks on the quiet ship, the full chaos of a functioning station hit her like something physical. But it was also extraordinary. She had grown up on Vaethari colony ships where every space was designed and controlled, and shared consciousness kept everyone moving in the same direction at the same pace. Here, beings bumped into each other and apologized or did not apologize and kept moving. A vendor shouted the price of his goods from across the corridor, and a child, some round-eyed species Saralith did not recognize, was crying and being held by a parent who was shushing it gently. Music came from 3 different directions in 3 different rhythms. Nothing was synchronized. Everything was alive. Finn was buying replacement medical supplies from a market stall when Saralith felt it, the particular quality of silence that fell around a Vaethari presence. She turned slowly. A Vaethari diplomat stood 20 meters down the corridor, tall, is silver-skinned, robed in the deep blue that indicated collective rank. He had the straight posture and empty expression of someone who communicated most of their meaning through the weave and did not need their face to do much work. He was looking directly at Saralith. His eyes moved to the crew badge on her jacket, the one Dara had given her with her name on it, and something in his expression tightened. He walked toward her. Finn noticed and stepped forward. "Hey, and is everything—" The diplomat spoke in Vaethari, and the station's public translator picked it up and broadcast it to the surrounding area in 3 languages. "This Voidborn is property of the Vaethari Collective under Exile Registry Code 7. She is to be returned to collective custody immediately for final processing." Final processing, the polite Vaethari phrase for the thing that happened after exile when someone was found. Yes, the corridor went quiet, in the particular way that crowds go quiet when something serious is about to happen. Beings from a dozen species stopped and watched. Finn's voice came through Saralith's earpiece. He was calling Dara. The diplomat reached out and closed one hand around Saralith's arm. Not rough, just firm and certain. The grip of someone who had never been told no in an official capacity. Saralith did not move. She was frozen in a way that had nothing to do with the diplomat's grip and everything to do with 17 years of being told she was nothing and no one. Then boots rang on the station floor. Fast and purposeful, Dara arrived. She walked through the watching crowd like she owned the corridor, Yuki and Osei 2 steps behind her, and she stopped directly in front of the diplomat. She was a full head shorter than him, and she looked up at him with an expression that was completely calm and completely immovable. "Take your hand off my crew," Dara said. The translator repeated it in 4 languages. The diplomat looked down at her with the faint, patient condescension of someone who dealt with less advanced species regularly. "This is a Vaethari collective matter. You have no legal standing here. A human. I have the crew sanctuary doctrine," Dara said, and she pulled a data card from her jacket and held it up so the station's legal registry scanner could read it. Registered under Earth Maritime Tradition, recognized by the Crosspoint Yova Station Charter, Article 14, or Section 3, any being formally registered as crew of a vessel under a recognized flag is under the full legal protection of that vessel's captain while within station jurisdiction. The station's legal AI spoke from the ceiling in a flat tone. Crew Sanctuary Claim Registered, ISV Resolute, Captain Dara Vasquez. The claimed individual is recognized as crew under current station charter. The diplomat's grip did not loosen immediately. He stared at Dara for a long moment. Dara did not blink. Around them, the watching crowd had grown. Several beings had their communication devices raised, recording the exchange. A Vorai station officer was making his way through the crowd toward them. The diplomat released Saralith's arm. "This is not finished," he said, and the translator gave every word its cold weight. "Yes, it is," Dara said simply. The diplomat turned and walked away through the crowd, which parted for him and then closed back like water. Saralith stood very still in the sudden space of it, the space where a thing she had feared all her life had just been stopped by a human woman with a data card and an expression like stone. Finn appeared at her side and said something quiet and checking. Yuki put a large hand briefly on her shoulder. Osei grinned and said something that the translator rendered as, "That was incredible," though she was fairly certain the original word was much stronger than that. Dara turned to her, and then she reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a small metal badge, the kind the crew all wore, and held it out. On the face of the badge, in clean human lettering with the Vaithari phonetic equivalent below it, was a single word. Saralith, not voidborn, not unbound, not the absence of a name. Her name, her real name, given back to her in a corridor on a neutral station by a woman who had known her for 3 weeks. "You're not unbound," Dara said, and the translator delivered it perfectly. "You're just ours." Saralith took the badge with both hands, and then, for the first time since the escape pod, and the crying, and the dying, and the silence, she broke. Not in a small way. In a full, complete, devastating way that had 17 years of weight behind it. If Finn's arms came around her before she could fall, and Dara's hand was on her back, and the crowd of alien strangers watched a girl who had never been held finally be held, and no one looked away, because it was the kind of moment that demanded to be witnessed. On Helix Station, Marin sat at the edge of a pale blue nebula and looked from the outside like a collection of glass bubbles connected by thin silver tubes, delicate and precise in the way that human science installations always were when the scientists had been left alone long enough to make the building match the work inside it. The ISV Resolute had a delivery here, specialized atmosphere processors for the station's biology labs, and Dara had arranged for a 2-day stay while the cargo was unloaded and the ship's water recycler was serviced. Saralith had not expected to leave the ship, but a researcher named Dr. Amara Okonkwo came aboard during the unloading and introduced herself to Dara and then asked, very politely, and through a translator that was significantly better than the ship's, whether the Vathari crew member might be willing to participate in a voluntary study. Saralith had learned enough about humans by now to know that voluntary meant she could say no and nothing bad would happen. She had tested this once already by refusing to eat Priya's spiced lentil dish and waiting to see what would occur. Nothing had occurred except that Priya shrugged and offered her something else. She said yes to the doctor. Dr. Okonkwo's laboratory was a bright white room full of machines that hummed at frequencies Saralith could feel in her back teeth. The doctor was a small woman with very precise movements and enormous round glasses, and the particular energy of someone who was excited about something they had not yet said out loud. The examination was not unpleasant. It involved sitting still while a scanner made a detailed map of Saralith's brain activity. So it involved looking at images while the scanner recorded her responses. It involved answering questions about what she felt when she watched the crew interact, whether she could identify what they were feeling, how certain she was, how quickly the sense came to her. Saralith answered honestly because she had stopped seeing the point in anything else. Then Dr. Okonkwo sat down across from her and was quiet for a moment in the way that meant she was organizing something important. "I want to show you something," she said through the translator, and she turned her screen so Saralith could see it. On the screen was a diagram of a Vathari brain, the standard version that the collective used in all its educational materials. Beside it was a second diagram labeled with Saralith's name. The two images looked similar at a glance, same general structure, same regions, but several areas in Saralith's diagram were significantly different, larger, more connected, and dense with pathways that the standard diagram did not have. "This region here," Dr. Okonkwo said, pointing to a section near the front of Saralith's brain diagram that was lit up in orange. "In a standard Vathari brain, this area is the Weave Reception Center. It processes the telepathic signal and distributes it through the rest of the brain." "I know," Saralith said. "Mine does not work." "That is what your people believed," Dr. Okonkwo said carefully. "But look at what that region is actually doing in your brain." The screen zoomed in. The area was not empty and not inactive. It was massively, extraordinarily active. It was not receiving a weave signal. But it was processing something else entirely. Something the doctor now labeled on the screen: micro-emotional field data. "Every living creature with a nervous system generates a small electromagnetic field," the doctor said, leaning forward with her hands clasped tight because she was working hard to stay calm. "It changes based on emotional state: fear, joy, stress, calm, deception, grief. Most species cannot detect this field consciously. Even the Vathari weave, which is extraordinary. It works on a completely different signal frequency and does not process this data at all." She paused. "Your brain does. Automatically, constantly, and with a level of precision that is, Saralith, I have no category for this in any existing research. You are reading the emotional state of every being within approximately 15 meters of you at all times, at a resolution that should not be biologically possible, processing it all in real time. And from what your answers tell me, you have been doing this your entire life without knowing it was unusual." Saralith stared at the screen. "You were not broken," Dr. Okonkwo said, and her voice was quiet now and careful, like she was handing something fragile across the table. "You were incompatible with the weave because the weave would have overloaded a brain already processing this much signal. Your body protected you from it. The weave, had it reached you, would have destroyed you." The room was very quiet. Saralith thought about the severance ceremony, the elders in white robes reading from their ancient texts in calm, certain voices. She thought about the pod drifting in the dark. She thought about 17 years of reaching into silence and finding nothing and deciding that nothing was all she was worth. She had not been empty. She had been the opposite of empty. She had been so full of the world around her that the weave could not fit inside her. She had been cast out for a gift she did not know she had. Something moved in the corridor outside the lab window, and she looked up, and there, standing in the glass-walled passage, was a Vathari woman in a traveling robe, silver hair swept back, hands folded in front of her, eyes that had been looking for something for a long time and had just found it. Her mother. Saralith did not move, and her mother had found her, directed here by the collective's tracking of the diplomat's encounter at Crosspoint Yova, and she was standing outside the glass with an expression that Saralith could now read with extraordinary clarity, because her gift worked perfectly well across species lines and always had. Her mother was not angry. She was not cold. She was devastated. the kind of devastated that had been living inside a person for a long time and had finally found a place to show itself. Soralith stood up slowly from the examination chair. She walked to the lab door. She put her hand on the handle, and she stopped there for a long moment. 17 years pressing against her from one side, and the woman who had not stopped them from casting her out pressing against her from the other. But she was not the same person who had left that colony ship in a pod. She had a name she wore on her jacket. She had a crew who fought for her in public corridors. Oh, she had a doctor who had just told her she was not broken but extraordinary. She pushed the door open and stepped into the corridor. Her mother looked at her, and Soralith looked back, and neither of them spoke yet. But Soralith was standing straight, shoulders back, badge on her chest, eyes clear, and she was not bracing for a blow. She was simply deciding what came next. Now, the corridor outside Dr. Okonkwo's lab was narrow and lit by the pale blue light that filtered through the station's outer glass, the light of the nebula outside, soft and cold and endless. Soralith and her mother stood 3 meters apart and looked at each other for a long time. Her mother's name was Vathis, a name Soralith had not been allowed to say publicly after the severance ceremony, because severed children did not speak the names of their families. Oh, she was taller than Soralith remembered, or maybe Soralith had just not looked at her properly in those last moments before the pod, because fear and grief had made everything blurry. Vathis opened her mouth and then closed it again. She tried twice before the words came. "I looked for you," she said, in Vethari, which Soralith still understood perfectly because the weave was not the same as language. When the reports came through the collective that an Unbound had been registered as crew on a human vessel, I knew it was you. "You watched them put me in that pod," Soralith said. "Yes," Vathis said, and she did not look away and she did not excuse it. "I watched. I was afraid, not of you. I was afraid of what they would do to the rest of us if I stopped them. Or I was afraid, and I chose fear, and I will carry that forever." Soralith's gift was working. It was always working, and she could feel the truth of every word her mother spoke like a hand pressed against her chest. The guilt was old and deep. The grief was real. The love underneath both of those things was also real and also old. It had been there the whole time, quiet and ignored, the way Soralith herself had been quiet and ignored. This was the hardest thing about her gift. It did not let her feel only what was convenient. "I am not ready to forgive you," Soralith said. And she said it calmly, not with anger, because she had learned from the humans that calm honesty was not the same as cruelty. "I do not know if I will ever be fully ready, but I can hear you. I am choosing to hear you." Vathis closed her eyes for a moment, and a tear ran down the silver line of her cheek. "There is something else," Vathis said, steadying herself. "The collective is changing. The incident at Crosspoint Yova, the recording of a human captain invoking sanctuary rights in front of 40 species, it circulated everywhere. The political faction that has been arguing against the exile law for years now has enough support to bring it to a formal vote. If the vote passes, unbound children will no longer be cast out." Soralith was quiet for a moment. "How many have there been?" she asked. "How many unbound children cast out before me?" Her mother looked down. "The records go back 400 years, Vathis said. "The number is not small." Soralith nodded slowly. She thought about small pods drifting in the dark. She thought about the hunger and the cold and the waiting for something to reach back. She thought about all the ones no ISV Resolute had ever found, all the silent endings scattered across 400 years of Vithari certainty. "The vote is not enough," Soralith said, and her voice was even and sure in a way she had not known she was capable of until this moment. "Changing the law is not enough. Someone needs to explain to the collective what they lost every time they did this. Someone needs to stand between the collective and every other species they have dismissed as primitive, and make them understand what it costs to refuse connection. Vathis looked at her, seeing her, maybe for the first time, as what she actually was instead of what she lacked. "Could you do that?" Vathis asked. Saralith thought about Dara, who had read her face in 2 seconds and changed the ship's course without a word. She thought about Finn, who checked expressions because he cared what was inside them. She thought about Priya and Yuki and Bensei and Osi, 6 people with no shared mind who had built something as warm and real as any weave. "I can do something better," Saralith said. She went back to the ship. She found Dara in the captain's cabin reviewing cargo logs and knocked on the open door. Dara looked up and put her tablet down, which was something Saralith had noticed she always did, and always put down what she was holding so she could look at the person properly. Saralith explained everything: Dr. Okonkwo's findings, her mother, the collective's vote, the 400 years of children in pods. Dara listened without interrupting. When Saralith finished, she said what she wanted to do. She wanted to stay on the Resolute. She wanted to use her gift as an interspecies emotional interpreter, a translator not of language, but of feeling. She wanted to sit in rooms where hive-mind species and individual consciousness species looked at each other with fear and suspicion, and she wanted to show them what they were actually feeling toward each other underneath all of that fear. She wanted to be the bridge. "We do not have a budget line for an interspecies emotional interpreter," Dara said. Saralith looked at her. The Dara's mouth curved slowly. "I can probably invent one." Word moved fast in the galaxy when it wanted to. The recording from Crosspoint Yova had already circulated widely, and the follow-up news that the unbound exile survivor had been found to possess an extraordinary biological gift spread through scientific and diplomatic channels within days. 3 separate multi-species councils sent formal requests to the ISV Resolute within the week, asking whether the Vathari crew member would be available for consultation on ongoing negotiations. Dara said she would need to check with her crew member first. She did. Saralith said yes to 2 of the 3. The Vathari Collective's exile law was formally put to a vote 6 weeks later. It failed to pass on the first attempt by a narrow margin, but the fact that it had gotten that far was, as Vathis told Saralith over a long-range communication channel, unprecedented in 400 years of collective history. The vote would happen again, and next time the margin would be smaller. On a quiet night on the Resolute, ship time quiet, the lights dimmed to warm yellow, the engines humming steady beneath her feet. Saralith stood alone in the observation lounge and looked out at the stars. She thought about the severance ceremony and the white robes and the calm, certain voices that had told her she was empty. She thought about the pod and the dark and the hunger and the waiting. She thought about a knock, 3 slow, firm knocks on a pod door, and the smell of food, and the warm orange light, and a woman with amber eyes who looked at her like she was simply worth seeing. She thought about a badge with her name on it. She pressed her fingers against the badge on her jacket, still there, always there, and she felt the ship around her like it was something alive. She could feel Dara 2 rooms away, calm and focused and faintly tired in the good way that comes from work, that means something. She could feel Finn laughing at something in the galley, a bright, clean burst of real amusement. She could feel Priya's deep satisfaction rolling warmly off the kitchen and down the corridor. She was not in a weave. She had never been in a weave. But she was in something, woven into something made of choice and stubbornness, and warm food pressed into hungry hands, and data cards produced in crowded corridors, and names given back after they had been taken away. She stood at the window with her hand on her badge and the stars going on forever outside the glass. And she was not empty, had never been empty, would never be empty again. They had cast her out because she could not hear the weave. They were wrong about what that meant. She was not silence. She was the thing underneath all the noise. She was the current of feeling that moved through every living being that had ever existed, the signal that ran beneath language and telepathy and species and distance. She had just been waiting all this time for someone to open a door. They cast her out because they thought she was empty. She was not empty. She was just waiting to be filled, and a human had given her everything.